is 4:30. The clerk has advised me that we have a quorum, so I'll call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 79 of the House of Commons Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting for a briefing with the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. Welcome, Minister. We'll more formally welcome you a little later.
We are currently
Hello.
Am I picking this up?
Good afternoon, MP Kwan. This is Anwar from the IT.
Okay. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room, and they're attending by Zoom as well. I would like to make a few comments before we begin. You have the option of choosing to speak in the official language of your choice, Madame Chabot. And if there is a breakdown in the translation, please get my attention. We'll suspend while it's being corrected. Those in the room, please raise your hand if you want to get my attention. Those on camera, use the raised hand icon. And as well, no screenshots are allowed to be taken when the meeting is in progress. I would also ask you to please speak slowly and keep your cell phones away from the microphone. It'll avoid popping, for the benefit of the translators as well. So with that, as I indicated, we have some members joining us. Mr. Maurice, who was acting chair for a while yesterday, is joining us, as well as we have Mr. Scheer, and Mr. Trudel is joining Madame Chabot and Madame Rosillo. I will advise that we do have a communications problem with Ms. Kwan online, where the quality is not sufficient to translate at this time. It is being worked on. So at this time, I would like to, before we begin, I'm going to conduct the meeting in two one-hour sessions. We'll have a health break after the first hour. For a couple of minutes, we'll suspend, and therefore then I will go back to the normal rotation that we have on the speaking order for the first hour, and then we'll revert to it again for the second hour so that we're clear. So I would like to welcome our witness this afternoon, Minister Fraser. Minister Fraser, welcome to Yuma, and the floor is yours for your opening statement, Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Chair, before you start the clock, how much time do I have?
5 minutes was almost unanimously agreed to by the committee, but I'm sure if you go over a second or two, we won't have an uprising.
5 minutes, I'll jump right in. Colleagues, if we're going to solve Canada's national housing crisis, we have to understand the constituent causes of the circumstances that we find ourselves in and advance specific measures that are tailored to overcome the very specific obstacles that are posing challenges to home construction in particular. One of the things that I want to acknowledge before I get into some of the challenges and potential solutions to those problems is the scale of what we're dealing with. We're talking about needing to build homes and to build them by the millions. We have about 16.5 million homes in this country, and we need to build more than 5 million more if we're going to restore a level of affordability that existed in Canada 20 years ago. The way that this is playing out is having very real impacts on real people and real communities across country. We're talking about students who are not able to find a place near where they're going to school. We're talking about young professionals, sometimes who are in a two-income household who can't afford to get into the market. We're talking about seniors who can't find an apartment when they're looking to downsize in a community where their grandkids are being raised. And of course, we're dealing with a significant number of people who have no place to call home. My view is that we as a society should aim to do better, and it's going to require the federal government working with provincial governments, municipalities, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, advocates, and of course parliamentarians to advance solutions that are going to have a meaningful impact. But we won't have a meaningful impact if we just come up with random ideas and throw them at the wall. We need to have targeted measures that are going to maximize the output when it comes to building more homes for Canadians at prices that they can actually afford. The first obstacle that I see is really the need to change the financial equation for builders. As a result of the increased cost of supplies and materials and labor, interest rates, the cost of land in Canada, and a number of other factors, it's really hard for people to say yes to projects, even where they have the workforce, even where they've already had a project approved. We've been advancing measures. You will have seen recently the removal of the GST on apartment construction in Canada that is resulting in more homes going ahead that otherwise would not have. You may have seen the changes to the Canada Mortgage Bond Program that are going to help free up low-cost financing. You will have seen programs that have existed as part of the National Housing Strategy, such as the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, that makes money available at a lower price for the people who are looking at the equation and saying, yes, I can go ahead now. There's other things that we can do as well, and I look forward to the advice of members of this committee. But it's not just the financial equation. We need to change the way that cities build homes, or in some instances don't build homes. We need to make sure that we're speeding up permitting processes. We need to make sure that cities are investing in housing enabling infrastructure. We need to make sure that they're actually zoning in a way that makes it legal to build the kinds of homes that are going to help solve the housing crisis. When it comes to changing the way cities build homes, we've introduced the Housing Accelerator Fund, a $4 billion fund that is starting to show very serious promise and is actually already changing the rules that cities have in place in places like London. Peter, I know we were visiting your community a few weeks ago. More recently, Calgary has made a decision explicitly that relied, at least in part, on an exchange of letters we've had regarding the Housing Accelerator Fund. Of course, we continue to invest in infrastructure that allows more homes to be built, such as water and wastewater, such as public transit funding and the like, that make sure we're building not just places to store people, but real communities that build homes for Canadians. As we continue to invest in housing, we can't forget that there are a lot of people who need homes that exist outside of the market. This was really the foundation for the National Housing Strategy, to build more affordable housing for low-income families. After 30 years of a lack of investment by both Liberal and Conservative governments, I should say, we are hundreds of thousands of units behind where we need to be if we're actually going to make sure people who cannot afford a place in the market still have a roof over their head. There's a social cost to not having the ecosystem exist as it should, and we need to work together to overcome it. Even if we get the policy landscape right on these other areas, we are going to run into a bottleneck at a certain point in time when it comes to the productive capacity of the Canadian industry to actually build the homes that we need. We can overcome this by investing in training programs, as we have in partnership with unions over the last number of years. We can continue to invest in programs like the Sectoral Workforce Solution Funds, but we can't just rely on training the existing Canadian workforce. We also need to continue to embrace immigration as a strategy to bring in the skilled workers that we need. We had previously made changes to the express entry system through the category-based selection model to bring in more people as permanent residents that actually have the skills that are necessary to build homes. But even if we get all of the people building, we got to change the way that they build homes. We don't build cars the way that we did a century ago. We're more efficient. We build them in factories now. We need to be looking at innovative ways to build housing more productively by investing in factory-built homes. We need to be embracing technologies, including modular housing, including panelization, including mass timber, including 3D printing, if we're actually going to change the way that we build homes so we can do it at a much larger scale than we are today. And we need to continue to support labor mobility, so workers that may be available in one jurisdiction in Canada can offer their skills to housing projects in other jurisdictions. There are improvements that I think we need to make on the coordination of programs as well between federal and provincial and municipal programs. And I think, in all honesty, we can probably improve the way that we administer programs that might require us to take on a little more risk by times to speed up the process for the projects that we want to support. Before I conclude, there are a few other categories that I'm happy to dig into should time permit, but we need to continue to respond to the changing nature of emergencies that put people in situations where they have no place to go. My own community was impacted severely by Hurricane Fiona last year, and people were displaced. We saw it again during wildfires, not just in Nova Scotia, but in communities across the country as a result of severe weather events that are driven by climate change. We need to continue to support communities through our programs that are dealing with severe homelessness problems, and we need as well to make sure that we're supporting emergency shelters in communities that are facing undue pressures. I don't want to ignore the need to also address the financialization issues that I know the Finance Committee has been studying, and I look very much forward to the reviewing the report that they're generating. But there are measures we've implemented around changes to the tax regime on short-term rentals, such as Airbnb, changes to the ability of foreign buyers to purchase and own homes, and taxation of people who are non-resident with non-occupied homes. And finally, we can't ignore that there is a generation of people who feel like they've been left out. If we build all the homes that we can build as quickly as we can, we're still going to have a significant number of people who find themselves with the inability to save up for a down payment to get into the market in the first place. My sense is if we tackle each of these problems with everything that we have, in collaboration with every level of government, in collaboration with the private sector and the nonprofit sector, we can make real progress. And if we aim for anything short of solving Canada's national housing crisis, I think we will be selling ourselves short. And I think Canadians deserve us to see us working together to advance measures to solve each of the problems I've outlined for you today. Mr. Chair, I don't know how close I am to my time. I expect I'm over, but I'm glad to be with you and happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. And I forgot to introduce with the Minister is Ms. Romy Bowers, President CEO of Canada Mortgage and Housing, and Ms. Kelly Gillis, Deputy Minister, Infrastructure and Communities. With that, we'll go directly to questions with Mr. Aitchison for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Minister, thank you for being here. Thank you for asking to come here, for starters. That's great. And thank you for being here for a 2-hour session. I have an easy one to start with. I know you will take it easy on you. This one stumped your predecessor. Do you believe that Canada is in a housing crisis?
I think I led with a statement saying if we need to solve Canada's housing crisis, so yes, I do believe we are living with a housing crisis in this country.
Was Canada facing a housing crisis 8 years ago, do you think?
I think there were a significant number of Canadians who were living in a crisis situation because of the lack of housing. Would it have constituted a nationwide crisis? I think that's a matter for subjective opinion. At the time, I was focused in my own community. We had an enormous supply of housing, but because we've seen a level of growth I couldn't have predicted, we are now facing similar challenges to big cities, even in rural Nova Scotia. So it would have been community dependent to me at the time and individual dependent at the time.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I mean, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment 8 years ago was about $973, and today, I'm sure you know. Do you know what it is today?
It would depend on the jurisdiction.
The average
certainly.
across Canada?
I don't have the specific average. I'm sure in 30 seconds we could find it.
It's double. We've talked about this, of course, before. It's $1,880. And so if it wasn't really a crisis, a national crisis, we would define it today as a national crisis. It wasn't a national crisis 8 years ago. In 2017, the Prime Minister announced his housing plan, called it life-changing, called it transformational. Had it become a crisis by then, would you say?
By 27, look, it depends on the specific community that you're in. The exact moment that you transition from dealing with real social issues to having a national crisis is a matter of opinion. I think somewhere along the way, the problem has become so much more widespread and frankly, fundamentally changed, in particular as a result of a changing economic landscape in the post-pandemic period that I see has really impacted a much wider array of Canadian families than it would have back in 2015.
But if the Prime Minister described his housing plan at the time as transformational and life-changing, that's some pretty bold language in 2017. Obviously, things were bad enough that he felt that we needed life-changing and transformational plan. He, announced it was initially $40 billion. It eventually crept up to $70 billion. Was that necessary then? I mean...
certainly it was necessary then, and in fact it was necessary 30 years before. One of the challenges that we're dealing with is we're trying to make up for lost time because successive governments of different partisan stripes didn't invest in housing. We re-entered the space in a way that no government has in my entire life. It was necessary, but we need to continue to do more. And as the social and economic landscape in Canada changes, so too must our policy trajectory. So my view is that it was essential. I'm very glad we moved forward with the National Housing Strategy, but I'm not here to tell you that was enough to solve the problems that we're dealing with today. We have a lot more work to do, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to do it.
So 8 years ago, the average minimum down payment was $22,000. Today, the average is, you guessed it, $50,000, double. Do you know what the benchmark price of a house was 8 years ago?
Not to the
country?
dollar. I have a sense that I know the point you're about to make.
Yeah, 452,000. In case you were wondering, today it's $750,000, and that is with this housing plan that was supposed to be life changing. Not the change I think maybe the Prime Minister was hoping for at the time. So I guess it begs the question that when 8 years ago your government took office, there were challenges, there were problems in the housing space. Maybe unique to certain parts of the country. It was more acute in some areas than others. A couple of years later, it was determined that we needed a life-changing plan. And the change that we have today is that house prices have doubled, rents have doubled, vacancy rates hover around 1% or lower across most of the country. Homelessness is on the rise. And now we have a new minister. You've come out swinging. Are the things you're announcing today, the new programs that we're hearing your government talk about? You had a housing retreat in the East Coast. You had another little session in London. You've announced you're going to do some really big things. What you're announcing today, would you describe it as life-changing, transformational housing?
Sorry, when you say what I'm announcing today, what are you referring to?
The programs you've been announcing, the HST.
In the last number of weeks. Look, I think they're important. They are going to fundamentally change the ability of the housing sector to produce more homes. I don't think the measures we've announced today in and of themselves will solve the crisis, but without them, I think it would be impossible. And if you'll indulge me for 30 seconds, Mr. Aitchison, we're talking about different problems compared to what we were discussing back in 2015 through 2017 when we were building the National Housing Strategy than the ones that you've outlined in your questions. The motivation behind the National Housing Strategy was to make up for 3 decades of governments not investing in affordable housing for low-income families. That's why you've seen the Co-Investment Fund, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, and more recently the Rapid Housing Initiative, targeting those housing developments that are designed to put a roof over the head of some of the most vulnerable people in the country. What we're seeing now is a far more widespread challenge that's impacting middle-class families very, very seriously. And the change in policy track you would have seen since my appointment as minister is the decided expansion of the range of homes that we're trying to support through new policies, including adding to the supply overall, so we have a greater ability for middle-class families to find a place to live as we continue to support the development of projects that will keep a roof over the head of low-income, vulnerable Canadians.
Thanks.
For 6 months.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Minister. I'm glad we received a bit of a history lesson today because, I'd like to jump in on that point. I was a municipal councillor back in 08-09 when the recession struck, and our affordable housing wait list in Hamilton at that point in time was, I think, about 3,600 to 3,700 individuals. Those people who sat on the affordable housing wait list were waiting anywhere from 3 to 5 years for an affordable unit to come, for their name to be called and for them to receive a unit. After the recession, and over the years that followed, that wait list jumped to almost 6,200, 6,300 names. And so I think if you asked us in 2015 whether there was a housing crisis, the answer would have been yes. We also, I should note that under the previous government, municipalities begged and pleaded for a national housing strategy. We noticed the jump, the doubling of people on the affordable housing wait list, and we asked and begged and pleaded the federal government for resources to assist seniors, single moms, families who couldn't find a way to make it work. And the government, your government, Minister, I wasn't here, but your government responded. And so I'm hoping that you can relay to the committee the importance of having a strategy. There seems to be a narrative in the House recently and just over the last number of months in terms of the fact that, bemoaning the fact that we have a national housing strategy, trying to poke holes in it, when we didn't have one with the previous government, when they ignored municipalities. And so my question to you would be, why is it important to have a national housing strategy? And why is it important to work with municipalities?
First, thank you for the question, and I think you added some useful context around the previous questions in the status of whether we were living in a crisis in 2015 or not. In Hamilton, I have no doubt to distrust exactly the case that you've just made. In my own community, things were very different, but now in my small town, a population of about 10,000 people, we're seeing homelessness for the first time. It's being driven by a number of different factors, not exclusively federal government policy, by the way. But I think federal government policy has an important role to play. And this is where we see a sea change between the approach that we're taking and that the previous conservative government took. And I should, to be fair, point to the cuts that were made in the early 90s under a Liberal government that actually discontinued investment in affordable housing for low-income Canadians. Cities can't do this on their own. There are things where they are uniquely responsible around zoning practices, around permitting processes, on prioritizing of infrastructure. But when we saw a lack of investment not only in housing but in infrastructure for many, many years, with the exception of the post-financial crisis injection of cash for the Building Canada Fund, we saw cities that were not prepared to grow when they started to experience population growth. Population growth is a major part of the economic strategy in the Atlantic provinces, for example. Without the investments that we've been making in infrastructure that have laid track for community growth, we would be in a much worse position than we are today. So from my perspective, it's essential to work with municipalities so we can incentivize them to overcome the barriers that are uniquely in municipal jurisdiction, but so we can partner from a funding point of view to build the housing enabling infrastructure. And to your question about having a strategy, if you got a problem and you don't have a strategy, you're never going to solve it. As the problem changes, my view is the strategy too needs to change, and that's why you've seen a new series of measures aimed at a wider array of homes than were uniquely the focus of the National Housing Strategy that was launched in 2017.
My next question would be around the provinces. You've addressed the issue with working with municipalities. We have a different approach on the other side of the table that is demonizing local mayors and municipalities for not building supply, and they've taken the stick approach. We're taking the carrot approach in terms of incentivizing municipalities. But the same needs to happen with provinces. I'm in the unenviable position of being in a province that has a Conservative government that has no affordable housing programs. I point to, as the shining stars in the country, British Columbia, Quebec, where all the stars have aligned, where the municipality is working with the province in consultation and cooperation with the federal government. But Ontario, that's not the case. And so could I ask, how do we create that healthy tension with the provinces, specifically Ontario, where in areas where they're more interested in making people rich rather than finding ways to help people who are on affordable housing wait list for a number of years?
Yeah, look, one of the things that you'll appreciate in my position is that I want to build healthy relationships with governments in every region of the country of different partisan affiliations. To a province, my sense is everyone recognizes there's a need for more housing. There are different viewpoints about what kind of housing we need, how we're going to build it, whether we should embrace urban sprawl or whether we should focus on intensification where services already exist. My view, particularly in medium and larger sized cities, is intensification is absolutely the way to go, particularly when you have a generation of young people who want to live in urban environments, who want to give to the community, and who have professional opportunities that are unparalleled in other parts of the country. My view is that we need to make sure we're identifying shared priorities, and regardless of which province, I can tell you there are projects that we both want to get behind. I actually think we would benefit from improving the coordination of our programs, both for housing and infrastructure, with the project selection and timing of the release of capital into the market for these different kinds of projects. But my approach is to pick up the phone, to call people, to meet them in person where it warrants, to actually talk through some of the challenges we're facing, because my sense is if you can agree on the nature of the problem, sometimes you'll realize you can pursue solutions in parallel, and sometimes you can pursue a common solution together. And depending on the partner, depending on the province, I think there's wins for us to put on the table in every region of the country.
Thank you.
Monsieur Trudel,
Oui.
pour 6 minutes.
Oui, merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here. First question, seriously. Mr. Trudeau did not give you a gift by appointing you minister. This is a crisis. It's very serious. I don't know if you understand the gravity. You talked about 5 million. I think the CMHC talked about more than 3 million. in Quebec is 1.1 million houses. Do you think the private sector could build 500,000? The predictions have dropped, but to be able to find a balance, we need to build 6,000 houses besides what is planned. So it's a huge plan. It's a huge building plan. I did a tour of Quebec, Gaspésie, Lac-Saint-Jean, Abitibi, and I saw a lot of distress. One of the goals of the strategy in 2017, as written down, was to reduce the chronic lack by 50%. Since then, in Quebec, that number has doubled. The last figures are from 2022. There are 10,000 homeless people that can be seen in Quebec. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've talked a lot about the fact that we need housing quickly. People no longer understand the strategy that is not producing what it's supposed to produce. Let's be concrete. The $4 billion that was adopted a year and a half ago, $4 billion for the Accelerator Fund with municipalities. It's a strange name for a program. And so far, not a single house has been built. That's strange. In Quebec, you are now negotiating with Quebec. 900 million at stake. We are saying that Quebec could add another 900 million. It's major, about 1.8 billion. So could we really, truly build houses and not focus on standards? I'm not saying it's not important, but there's a priority in Quebec to quickly build houses, to quickly get results. What have you obtained with your negotiations with Quebec, Mr. Minister? Thank you for your questions. And before we start, you talked about the Prime Minister giving me a gift. It's not a gift. It's an opportunity to make a difference. It's a very important issue for our country. And now for the Accelerator Fund for Housing. We have a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope in this fund, but it's important to understand the reasons for it. It's not simply to build a house here and there. The reasons for that fund is to change the way of building homes in every community, to change regulations in cities and municipalities. Even in Quebec, it's not possible for municipalities to negotiate directly with the federal government. That's fine. We are good partners with the Minister Rousseau. We have conversations to obtain an agreement to ensure the proper use of funds and increase the number of houses in Quebec. Furthermore, in English, we're trying to speed up the process.
Sure that will enable more housing.
Monsieur le ministre, qui retarde?
Mr. Minister, who is responsible for the delay? You are saying that you are negotiating, but that's a provincial jurisdiction, Quebec. It's Quebec to build homes. It's Quebec to agree with municipalities. If Quebec were to sign that 900 million check, they could build. Why are you blocking Quebec's work, the work that Quebec is used to doing, the work that municipalities are used to doing? Your job, we have an enormous tax capacity. There's 900 million lying there, whereas people are on the streets. So why is this $900 million a problem in Ottawa?
Ce n'est pas un problème, mais c'est...
It's not a problem. It's only normal. We started with a $4 billion fund, so it's important that we make sure that the program works well. When I started my speech today, I mentioned the need for Canada to change the way houses are built.
We're never going to solve it. We have to change the system, and if we work with the provincial government of Quebec to identify shared priorities on how we can implement systemic change, we can actually solve this problem.
Tout le monde sur le terrain au Québec, M. Fraser m'a dit que...
Everybody in Quebec says that Mr. Fraser just wants to build they just want to build houses. They come up with programs, the cities come with programs, and the federal government comes with additional programs. Everybody wants the checks to be paid out to Quebec so that money is provided for houses to be built. I don't know why Ottawa is interfering. Everybody agrees.
Look, I don't view partnering with provinces on shared priorities to be interference. We're contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to different jurisdictions. In Quebec, close to $1 billion, as you've indicated. Both Canada and Quebec want to see communities build more homes. Both Canada and Quebec want to see communities speed up the process to approve homes. Both Canada and Quebec want to see homes across a range for middle-class families and vulnerable families. These are the ordinary conversations after we establish a program in our budgetary process to land on an agreement for what we're trying to achieve with the money. Pumping money alone without a systems change built into the programs is not going to solve the problem.
Trudel, Ms. Kwan, I believe your sound is fine, so 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Is my sound okay?
So far, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Minister for his opening comments and for acknowledging the fact that the housing crisis is caused by successive Liberal Conservative governments from walking away from building social housing and co-op housing. In fact, it was the Conservatives that canceled the co-op housing program in 1992, and the Liberal government canceled the National Affordable Housing Program in 1993. So for 30 years, the successive Liberal and Conservative governments relied on market forces to provide the housing that Canadians need. And it's been, frankly, a massive failure. We have record homelessness, rent skyrocketed, young people priced out of the market, and we have the housing crisis that we are faced with today. As the minister indicated in 2017, the Prime Minister announced a national housing strategy with much fanfare. Actually, I remember this, and even proclaimed that adequate housing is a basic human right. However, the Liberal government slow-walked the rollout of the funds, resorted to double counting to inflate the numbers, was slow to renew the operating agreements for nonprofits and co-ops, resulting in more loss of subsidized social and co-op housing units. The auditor has issued damning reports with the situation. I won't belabor all of those points because it's all on the public record. The minister admitted that we have a deficit in social housing stock. Canada's social housing stock is amongst the lowest in the G7 countries at a mere 3.5%. And so we need to actually enhance and increase the social housing and co-op housing stock. Currently, under the National Housing Strategy, it pegs the development of 16,000 units of social housing per year. That's not going to do it. It's not going to meet the requirement and the housing needs that Canadians have. So my first question to the minister is, will he commit to increasing the social housing stock where rent is no more than 30% of total income to at least 2 million, so that we actually have a fighting chance to meaningfully address the housing crisis?
Thank you very much. And look, just maybe before I do my best to answer the question, I think one of the key points, Ms. Kwan, that you made during your remarks was tracing back to 1993 decisions that were made. And it just kind of struck me because, look, in 1993, I was 8 years old. This problem didn't emerge overnight. It emerged over the course of my entire life. It's not going to be solved overnight, and though I will agree that we need to do more to continue to build out more non-market homes in Canada, I think we have to acknowledge that it is going to take place over a number of years. I will commit to introducing reforms that will increase the share of non-market homes in Canada. The exact definition that you're using is something that I think I owe my team and frankly Canadians a little more policy work on to assure myself that I have the definition that's going to ensure the most number of people have a roof over their heads at a price that they can afford regardless of the level of their income, because I believe the social cost of homelessness is extraordinarily high. And I think it's incumbent upon governments to do more to build out that stock. And I'm happy to give the floor back to you to make sure we're focused on your priorities in this exchange.
Yeah, and so 30 years ago, I was a community legal advocate. That is the reason why I enter into electoral politics. When the federal Liberal government canceled the National Affordable Housing Program, successive Liberal and Conservative governments caused this problem. So now you're at the helm. And so we have a chance, hopefully, to fix the problem. So instead of tinkering around the edges, we need bold action. So actually building social housing and co-op housing, we know it is effective and it works. It will house people in need. So I look forward to the minister announcing the increase in the development of social housing and co-op housing. The NDP's call for a fund for the nonprofit sector, an acquisition fund. And so will that be part of the mix?
Look, I don't have an announcement to share regarding an acquisition fund at committee today. It's one of the options that I've learned of since I've been appointed to this position that is trying to address the unique issue, in particular the loss of organic affordable housing, if I can use that phraseology. There are rental units that exist in the market today that are at prices that people can afford, and we are losing them quickly. An acquisition fund is not necessarily the only way to make sure we're protecting the loss of that affordable housing, or even to acquire properties that you could expand or build affordable housing on. And I'm trying to identify what I view to be the best option to make sure we're delivering the largest number of homes at the most cost-effective price.
Well, to be sure, the acquisition fund is not the only way, but it's certainly one way, and it's something that the NDPs call for. Another way is to stop the loss and the erosion of existing low-cost rental apartments, to which the way to deal with it is to put a ban on that erosion to financialized landlords, to profiteering landlords from purchasing and sweeping up the low-cost apartments in our communities and then jacking up the rent, rental evicting people, demo evicting people. That's another option. As Steve Pomeroy has indicated, for every one unit is built in terms of affordable housing, you lose 15. So you need to build and you need to stop the erosion. So that's what the NDP is calling for. The other thing that I want to raise with the minister is this.
Ms. Kwan, your time's up. So if you could quickly phrase your question.
All right. I'll be very quick. On the housing benefit, in 2022 budget, the government made, the NDP forced the government to deliver a one-time $500 housing benefit to help low-income Canadians. And with the rollout, the Liberals acted unilaterally to change the eligibility criteria, leaving out the most vulnerable and lowest income people. So how did the Liberal government reach this decision to limit the benefit? And what is the minister's going to do to fix it?
Thank you, Chair. And look, I've got the CEO of the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation is going to chime in on this response.
Thank you very much for the question. This is a question that's been raised at this table before, and there was no change in the definition of the benefit. I think there was some misunderstanding about how that it was communicated, but it was not our intention to cut out certain segments of the population. But we did have to draw some lines in the sand in terms of determining who was eligible. So I think this is we're very happy to provide the definitions that were used and have further discussions on this. Based on that submission.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Scheer for 5
Unbelievable.
minutes. Mr. Scheer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. One of your government's main signature pieces to address the housing crisis that you now acknowledge that has certainly pushed the dream of home ownership out of the reach of so many Canadians over the last 8 years was the Housing Accelerator Fund. This program was announced 2 years ago with $4 billion of taxpayers' money behind it. So in that time, can you tell the committee how many homes have been completed thanks to the Housing Accelerator Fund? Just the number, please.
Look, I know the line of questioning is designed to try to set a trap because you and I both know that the fund is now rolling out with investments that's changing the way cities build homes. It was announced as part of the 2021 campaign, budgeted last year, and it's now changing the way, but it's only now starting to have an impact.
Okay, so this is a 2-year-old announcement. It's been 2 years.
It was a 2-year-old campaign commitment. It was implemented in last year's budget.
You've had 2 years.
It started rolling out 2 weeks ago.
If you know the line of questioning, then you should know the answer. So how many homes have been completed?
I think it's. I reject entirely the false pretense that
Sorry.
underlies your question,
Sorry,
because
this is
going to
Mr.
fundamentally
Chair.
change the
No,
way
no.
cities build homes. It's not.
Mr.
I'm
Chair.
not to be tricked here.
This is not a trick. It's not a trick question to ask how many results have come out of a government program. In fact, in your opening comments, you said that, quote, we can't just throw ideas against the wall. And then you went on to say you have to measure results and, quote, maximize output. This is a 2-year-old announcement, $4 billion of taxpayers' money. If just tell us the answer. Like, if it is it warmer,
the trick
colder,
that you're
is it
trying to
double
play
digit?
here.
It's not a trick. It's not a trick.
It's cute that
How
you're
can
playing this
asking
game.
for a number? How,
Mr. Chair,
with all
do
due
I have an
respect,
opportunity to answer the question?
It's a very simple question.
Mr. Scheer's time.
Fine.
He hasn't answered it. I'd like to know the number. A 2-year-old announcement, $4 billion of
The
taxpayers'
Housing
money.
Accelerator
How many completions?
Fund. The Housing
How many
Accelerator Fund
completions?
doesn't actually directly build homes. It changes the way cities build homes, and then builders in those cities build homes. Right now, we expect this is going to have an impact of thousands of new homes for Canadians, but having only started rolling out the fund 2 weeks ago, it's only now starting to change those
Sorry.
ways. It's going to play out over the next few years.
We're going to measure this from when the government announced it. That's 2 years ago, $4 billion. Just tell us the number.
So 2 years ago, for the clarity of people who might be watching at home, the way that policies are implemented, after you campaign on it, you budget for them, and then you implement them after the fact. This is a 2-week-old program in terms of us rolling it out.
Canadians who have been forced out of their homes and now living in their cars, students who have to live in tents, families who now have to share one-bedroom apartments with other families, they don't have time, Minister. You announced this program 2 years ago. The question was very simple. How many homes have been completed with this $4 billion program? Just tell us the number.
Encourage my colleague to drop the feigned outrage. He had almost a decade in government when he did absolutely nothing to build more homes in this country.
Let's
we have
talk
done
about
more
a
in the
decade
past
ago.
2 weeks than
Let's
his
talk
government
about
has
8
done
years
in 10
ago.
years in government. And if he wants to be cute with the way he answers questions for a Facebook clip, go right ahead. I'm going to focus on building homes for Canadians.
Wow. If the minister thinks it's cute to ask questions on behalf of desperate Canadians who don't know how they're going to make their next mortgage payment or their next rent payment, or 35-year-olds who have moved back into their parents' basement, if he thinks that's cute, he can look Canadians in the eye and tell them that. This was a very simple question, and you have refused to answer because the answer is, in fact, zero. And that's a complete failure. And if you want to talk about 8 years ago, let's talk about 8 years ago when housing costs were half of what they are now.
And
when
the
the
rate of
average
building was
mortgage
half of what
payment
it is now.
was half of what it is now. The average rent payment was half of what it was now. Be happy to compare the housing record of 8 years ago then with today. Now, in Budget 2022, the Finance Minister promised that over the next 10 years, we will double the number of new homes we build. Since that time, have housing starts gone up or down?
It depends where you measure from or if you cherry pick data. But if we compare to the time that you were in government, housing construction is nearly twice what it would have been.
Minister, I'm not cherry picking data. I'm picking the date on which your colleague, the Minister of Finance, made that promise. Since that time, have housing prices gone up or down?
Housing prices?
Sorry, housing starts gone up or down. We can answer on prices too, but have housing starts gone up or down since the minister promised to double the number in the next 10 years?
Just before we get to your question, I don't think any member of this committee or any party in the House of Commons has a monopoly on caring about vulnerable people who have very real housing needs. One of the things I actually think is really
doing
healthy,
something.
I agree.
Something.
And I'm happy to talk about what I'm doing. But one of the things that I think is really important and actually very healthy in our democracy, and I credit all parties in the House, I think we're in agreement on what some of the problems are. Okay. But back to the Housing Accelerator Fund that you had pointed to, it has a very specific purpose. It is not throwing anything at the wall. It's designed to change the way that cities build homes, and it's having that desired impact today.
Chair.
Point of order, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Your time.
Chair, point of order.
Your point of order.
It's a simple point. When witnesses, regardless of whether or not they're ministers, and I understand Mr. Scheer wants to make a political point here, but when witnesses are given questions, we should allow them the time to offer an answer. That's basic decorum to maintain order at committee.
On the same point,
Mr. Scheer.
there is a well-established convention that the length of time for the answer should be commensurate with the length of time for the question. And when the questions are simple yes or no,
You didn't follow
or
it.
up or down, or just the number. Shouldn't take 3 or 4 minutes to answer that kind of
Thank you,
question.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Fragascatus. We will go to Mr. Coteau for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here. I just want to start by saying that there's no question that this issue is, it impacts all communities across this country, and all members on this committee are concerned about this issue because it impacts our neighborhoods and people who live in the ridings we represent. But I do think that there's a, this narrative that the price of homes have just, increased since 2015. It's a false narrative. I bought my house in 2007, which was basically a year after the Conservative government came into power, and it was the average price in Ontario was just under $300,000. By the time 2015 hit, it was at $700,000. So this has been an ongoing issue in Canada, and the trajectory has just gone. It's increased so much. And we all, as MPs, have to look for ways to find solutions. And I'm happy with the new initiative to remove GST from new developments. And I don't know, Minister, if you saw, and I think you made reference to the article that came out in Toronto last week. 5,000 new units are going to be built because of this new initiative. Can you speak specifically to this initiative, and what do you think the impact's going to look like across the country?
So thank you for this, and I think it's important, back to the point that I led with in my opening remarks, the measures that we introduce have to be designed to solve very specific problems. When I look at the decision to remove GST on the construction of apartments in Canada, it's designed to address the supply challenges that the housing sector is facing, which is driving up the price of homes across this country. Going back not only over the time that we've been in government, but during the government before, we've seen a steady increase in the price of homes. It's accelerated more recently, particularly during the pandemic, when more people bought properties and we're dealing with historically low interest rates. But since then, the financial landscape has changed. The cost of labor has gone up, the cost of supplies and materials has gone up, the cost of land has gone up, and interest rates have gone up. If we're dealing with builders who have, by the way, hundreds of thousands of units that are already approved across Canada, we need to get them to a place where the equation they're looking at takes a project off the shelf and puts shovels in the ground. By removing the GST, I've seen estimates as high as 200 to 300,000 new homes for Canadians over the next 10 years. The 5,000 you mentioned is one story. Many of the units, by the way, from that developer are going to be affordable. But that's one example I've heard of. I read an article today that cited that example, but pointed to 2 other developers who are now saying they're moving ahead with 3,000 unit projects and 1,000 unit projects directly in response to this measure. This is going to cause an awful lot of home builders to take that project that has been yellow lit, green lighted, and start building it right away. This is going to have a major impact. It's one of the most important things we could do. And housing advocates, not just developers, but those looking to build more low-income housing as well, are big advocates for this specific measure, and that's why we've done it.
You did recognize the importance of partnerships with provinces, and I think that regardless of political differences, politicians of all stripes should be working together to look for solutions. What's that relationship look like in regards to other provinces, and is there any appetite to remove provincial taxes from these initiatives?
One of the things that's important to understand is that the federal government has an important role to play, but we need everybody at the table. I am so optimistic about the opportunity to make a difference because of the response I've seen from different levels of government. With respect to the GST, this is actually an excellent example. We've seen other provinces follow suit or advance similar measures in British Columbia, in Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador, more recently my home province of Nova Scotia. And just to put that into perspective, when you're dealing with a removal of a 15% value-added tax at the end of a project, and you're dealing with a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars, this is millions of dollars in difference that's going to change that equation. So when provinces get on board, it's going to further accelerate the rate of building as a result of the federal government's decision to step out and make that change.
So you also mentioned modular homes. I'm a big fan of just alternative housing, options, from prefabricated to, tiny homes to, there's so many different, you talked about 3D printing homes. Where do these alternative housing solutions fit into your strategy?
They're complementary to the different challenges that we need to overcome, because if we get the financial equation right, if we change the permitting process, if we invest in non-market housing, if we coordinate our programs perfectly, if we do everything perfectly, we're going to hit a bottleneck. And it's going to be the productive capacity of the Canadian workforce to produce the homes that Canadians need. If we don't change the way we build homes and continue to have people put up stick-built homes one house at a time, we're never going to escape the challenge that we're currently wrestling with. But if we make the kinds of investments that will increase the productive capacity of the Canadian workforce, and we can significantly improve the number of homes that we build per the person that's working on those homes and per the hour that's spent building those homes, I think we can solve this challenge. If we aim to do something short of that, I think it would be a moral failure. But by investing in innovation that will actually grow the capacity of Canadians to build more homes, we can actually then leverage the difference that we're making with the financial changes, the regulatory changes, the investments in specific kinds of projects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Monsieur Trudel, pour 2 minutes.
You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. The GST, we agree it could maybe help us build more homes, but we are not going to build more homes than people can afford. There's the issue of affordability. We have to build houses that people with low incomes can afford. We know that the middle class is going down and there's a problem of housing. So what are you planning to do to address the issue of affordability with the builders?
One of the things that's really important to understand, because when I first heard of the notion that we should remove the GST to build more apartments, my first reaction was we might want to have some affordability criteria. I spent about 5 minutes digging into the issue before I realized how wrong that would have been. When we actually address the supply challenge more broadly, it's one of the biggest things we can do to reduce over time the cost of homes. And in fact, one of the developers that was mentioned by my colleague as part of the 5,000 units has one project that is 43% affordable. The way that most modern housing developments are being built in cities today, certainly, involve a mix where you have some market homes and some non-market homes. I don't want to be building cheap homes in a bad part of town that are exclusively for low-income families where they don't have access to the services that they need. I want them to be integrated into communities and have full participation, living alongside people from different income backgrounds. In addition to removing the GST to boost supply and have mixed developments, I also want to continue to see support for non-market housing directly. We have existing programs like the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, like the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. We had the Rapid Housing Initiative through the pandemic. We've done more to build out affordable housing than any government in my lifetime, and we need to continue to make those kinds of investments because I agree with you that this is an enormous challenge that we need to overcome.
Un autre point très précis.
Another more specific point. In Quebec, 72,000 social houses were built with money from the provincial government and the federal government. Now there are 5,000 of these houses that cannot be used because of lack of renovation. So the cost of the renovation is being negotiated now. Tomorrow, if you were to send a check to Ms. Bowers tomorrow and give her the mandate to sign, those about 5,000 houses could be renovated and be ready for the 1st of July. I do not understand what is the problem with those negotiations.
And you're referring to negotiations on the Housing Accelerator Fund?
Non, pas du tout. Ce sont des HLM. Monsieur le Président, si vous me permettez, c'est important. Ce sont des HLM.
These are houses that were built between the federal government and the provinces. Right now, that's 72 low-cost houses financed by the province and the federal government. And the CMHC negotiates the cost of renovation, and many of them are not accessible. These are houses that are available. If you accept to give a check to Quebec Now, those houses could be renovated by the 1st of July, and we could be able to house 50% of the 10,000 people now on the streets in Quebec.
My colleague would want to chime in as well, but I agree with the member that we need not only build new homes, we must also build new homes, but also restore the ability of homes that could be made available at an affordable price. I'd be happy to speak with him after the meeting to dig in more detail about the specific issue. And Ms. Bowers, I don't know if you want to supplement that answer with anything more detail. We can save it for after, Mr. Chair,
Time
if
is
we're
up.
out of time.
Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes.
The Conservatives want you to believe that they will be the savior to the housing crisis. Let's be clear. When the Conservatives were elected in 2006 and under the Liberals to 2021, Canada lost over 1,030,000 units of housing that were rented at $750 a month. That's both under Liberal and Conservatives. That's part of the housing crisis that we're faced with today. Both of them created this problem. Now, to Ms. Bowers' answer, she should know that the housing benefit change was from the department where they told applicants that if their rent was paid directly from the government, that they would not qualify for the housing benefit. That's why the most vulnerable people did not get the support that they needed. And that was a unilateral change by the Liberals on their own. On the GST, my question to the minister is this. Why is the GST exemption not being applied for co-ops? And would the minister support the NDP's suggestion on amending the bill so that housing co-ops could access the GST exemption? And in addition, will the government also allow for existing social housing projects to qualify for the exemption?
Thanks very much for the question, and though I have many thoughts about the precursor around various governments' plans, I'll try to focus on the question that you've asked. So first of all, I think co-ops actually have the potential to be a large part of the solution for non-market housing in Canada. The reason that they weren't scoped into the GST rebate was it had a number of factors. One, there are other measures that provide a significant degree of tax exemptions for co-ops today, and the measure was scoped for purpose-built rentals. And of course, members of co-ops tend to own shares in the co-op. It's not quite the same as a rental, but it provides opportunities for low-income people to find homes. We also have a program that had $1.5 billion worth of investments in co-ops, which was the largest in 30 years. So we want to support them. We had decided to do it in a different way. On the question of how we can improve this measure to scope in more kinds of projects, whether it's nonprofits under construction, whether it might be expanding access to other forms of housing, I would actually value the feedback of this committee, but I do want to make sure I give myself the opportunity to conduct a proper analysis to understand and to assure that we're getting the greatest degree of protection for low-income Canadians and to grow the housing supply in the most cost-effective way. So if there are proposals that come from this committee on this subject, I would be more than happy to study them and come up with a formal response.
Ms. Gray, and then Mr. Long will conclude the first round. And Ms. Gray for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. So, Minister, you talked about a housing crisis. Is it the Government of Canada's official position that Canada is in a housing crisis?
I don't know that we establish official positions when we label something a crisis or not. It's my view that we are in a housing crisis, and I want to approach it from a policy point of view as though it is.
So during the time that you have been in government, which has been the entire time that you've been elected, did you at any point kind of step back and say something isn't working and my government is responsible for this housing crisis?
I don't think you can attribute the housing crisis that we're living into to any one government, any one level of government, any one political party. My sense is that it's driven as much by forces that exist in the market and a lack of investment over a generation, more than decisions of the government. I've been actually quite proud of a lot of the work that we've done to step back into the housing space, and I think we've been on a good track, and we need to be on a better track.
Thank you, Ms. So are there any policies that have contributed over the last 8 years while your government has been in power that have contributed to the housing crisis? Are you willing to acknowledge that there have been policies that have actually contributed to the situation that we're in, where people can't even afford rent, people can't even afford to live in a home? Will you acknowledge that there are policies that have actually contributed to the crisis?
My sense is the bigger challenge is a result of what has not been done over a much longer period of time, rather than a specific policy that's driving the crisis. If there's one in particular you're thinking on, I'm happy to give you my thoughts.
Well, like inflationary deficit spending, which has led to inflation going up, which has caused interest rates to go up. So there are a number of things. But I'd like to move on to something else, Minister, actually. We know that people are having a really tough time. And the director of Viola's Place, which is a shelter in your riding in New Glasgow, told media that beds have been full all summer and their services are increasingly used by middle-income earners and seniors. And I hear this in my riding. We hear this across the entire country. So out of your roughly $82 billion national housing strategy, what program will get people out of this shelter and into a home that they can afford?
So first, I categorically reject your assessment on inflationary deficits, because the counterfactual would have been millions of Canadians would have lost their jobs and their homes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you take objection to us supporting homes, households and businesses and blame the inflationary pressures on COVID spending, I think I'd have that debate. I would also point out that I believe more of the inflation is being driven by supply-side factors than purely a government spending issue. Viola's Place is a tremendous asset to our community. We recently dropped food after one of our events with local volunteers to support the work that they do.
Thank you, Minister. Back to my time here. So you can debate with the Parliamentary Budget Officer, because he had actually put out a report stating that a lot of the spending didn't have to do with the pandemic. But I'll move on to another question. The Deputy Minister of Housing in Nova Scotia said that the province needs, quote, 70,000 new units of all types in the next 5 years. Will your housing accelerator build 70,000 units in the next 5 years in Nova Scotia?
The Housing Accelerator Fund on its own, no. It will make a significant difference, but we hope that the complete suite of policies that we're going to introduce will help cure the supply gap. The exact time that we will achieve the goal is a result of factors that are not within the control of any one level of government and is subject to market forces. But my goal is to cure the supply gap and solve Canada's national housing crisis. It will be very difficult to do, but I can't tell you with certainty the exact number of homes that any one fund will result in a particular community. But the Housing Accelerator Fund will be a major part of the solution.
Okay, thank you, Minister. The damning report from the Auditor General of Canada on homelessness says that your government can't show that your efforts have reduced homelessness. And Halifax has seen a 60% increase in homelessness in the last year and a 500% increase in 2018. So by what date will the Housing Accelerator program cause homelessness rates to decrease? It's to the point that I made, and this is really important, and I'm not just trying to eat up time. If you need to extend 15 seconds, Mr. Chair, to accommodate this, it's really important. Each of the policies that we're putting forward are trying to solve different challenges. The Housing Accelerator Fund is designed to change the way that cities build homes. It is not a direct program that's directed specifically at curing homelessness. We have other programs that are designed to do that. It will help by growing the housing supply, but the combined impact of the Housing Accelerator Fund, the National Housing Strategy, Reaching Home, and others is going to have a meaningful impact. But I can't tell you the specific date that fund will, because it's not the only thing aimed at solving that problem.
Mr. Long, to conclude the first round, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to my colleagues. And Minister, thank you so much for coming to chat with us. First and foremost, I'm really pleased to hear you say that we do have a crisis, and it is successive governments' lack of action, if you will, that have got us to where we're at. A few points. My province of New Brunswick grew by 49,000 people last year. It grew by 49,000 people the 29 years before that. That is something that, it's a good thing for growth, but obviously when you bring in 50,000 people in 1 year, that's going to put a lot of pressure on housing stock, number one. In my province, we have a premier who boasts about a $1 billion surplus, a Conservative premier that boasts about a $1 billion surplus this year, yet has invested in housing that wouldn't fill 3 streets. It's unbelievable, the lack of focus. And I will say, too, Minister, before I get to my question, you know, I came in 2015, happy to be here. In 2016, I did some research on previous policies that the federal government has enacted, the government before us had enacted, and what I got back was a blank sheet. I was shocked. I said, well, where's all the policies that the previous government enacted federally? And there wasn't any. And I was shocked to see that. So, you know, I congratulate you. I think that we've shown a lot of leadership, stepping up, recognizing that we need all levels of government to solve this crisis. We need the federal government, we need the provincial government, municipal government, and let's not forget the private sector. So first question, ministers, can you just talk about the importance, how all those 4 or the 3 levels of government and the private sector need to work together and what we are doing to make that happen? Thank you.
Yeah, and look, the story of your provinces is not too different from mine. And in Atlantic Canada, with the population growth we've seen, including a number of Canadians moving during the pandemic to the East Coast, what's ironic is part of the reason you're seeing surpluses for governments that were in very shaky fiscal ground before the pandemic is home values have increased and provincial governments have collected their share of HST to a much larger degree and now have money in the kitty. To credit my home province's government, they've recently, after they reported $116 million surplus, announced they too would be piggybacking on the GST measure we've discussed by waiving the provincial share of tax. That demonstrates the kind of work we need to do together if we're going to leverage the maximum number of homes out of every public dollar spent. No one level of government can do this alone. We're talking about millions and millions of homes, and we need the people who build them to be part of it too. We need municipalities to change the way that they permit homes to speed up the process of permitting them and making it legal to build the homes that people need by building more densely. We need provincial governments to get on board by supporting programs to build more housing with direct financial support, and we need to better coordinate the different programs that we have so we can work together. My hope is we continue to experience the benefits of population growth on the East Coast and that we can collaborate across levels of government to make sure our communities are ready to successfully absorb the people who want to move there.
Thanks for that. I want to hone in on cities, my city, obviously, of St. John, my riding of St. John Rothsay. You know, I'm seeing municipalities, and it's a good thing, they're becoming seized with the problem. They understand that they have to be part of the solution. But, you know, there's so many cities that just don't have the capacity, they don't have the department, they don't have the people, the staff, permitting people, what have you, to accelerate, if you will, this issue. So can you just talk about the Accelerator Fund and talk about its importance to cities like my city of St. John?
Yeah, and keep in mind that the fund isn't just designed to pay for the new permitting system that's implemented, but it's a fund that contributes to infrastructure or housing projects and the systems that can be implemented. But part of the conditions to access the fund are that you're going to change the way that you get homes built. I think, for example, of the conversation that we had in your colleague to your right city just a few weeks ago, we had a really healthy proposal from the City of London that was going to lead to them making certain changes, building more homes where people could access services and the like. We sent them a response indicating other ways we thought that they could build homes more quickly, including allowing people to build 4 units as of right on the properties that they may own in the city, including zoning more densely, in particular around places like post-secondary education institutions and transit developments. And the mayor, Josh Morgan, I should give credit to, responded in the best possible way, saying we want to do this. And as a result, we're investing $74 million in the city that's going to add thousands of homes that otherwise would not have been built. Other cities across the country can change the way that they build homes, change the process to permit them, and legalize housing. They can make it legal to build the homes that will actually help solve the housing crisis. If we actually change the rules and have a federal incentive to drive municipal change, we can make a heck of a difference.
That will conclude the first round. I'm going to suspend for 2 minutes for a health break, and then when we come back, we'll begin the second round. So we'll suspend for 2 minutes. Suspend. Our seats. Thank you, Minister. We'll now resume with the second hour. Again, we'll lead with Ms. Ferrari for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and obviously limited time, so we'll be as fast and furious as we can to get as much information here. Thank you, Minister. You're quoted in 2021 that your Liberal government was able to lock in long-term interest rates. Can you tell the committee how much interest rates have increased since 2021 in percentage, please?
It would depend from exactly where in 2021, but it would have gone from record lows, a fraction of a percent, to now in excess of 5%.
Yeah. So 4.75% if we look at when it was, which is what a lot of people put into their mortgage and then they're up for renewal, which is what we see in terms of people collapsing on their ability to refinance their mortgage and creating homelessness. Do you know the amount allocated to the Reaching Home program, which was targeted to reduce homelessness?
Do you have the specific amount under Reaching Home? Yeah, it's a $4 billion fund.
So there was 1.36 billion spent in 3 years specifically on Reaching Home, and I'm going to get to why I'm asking that, which is targeted at reducing homelessness. Now, a colleague of mine has already brought this up, but I think it's important for people to watch at home because they may not know what's happening in terms of policy. How did we get to where we are? 10 cities have taken over across this country. But there was an Auditor General report, and it had some pretty scathing remarks. Can you share with the committee, or would you rather I share with the committee, what the Auditor General report stated about the Liberals' investment and targets to reduce homelessness were?
Go ahead.
So
I have a feeling you're going to one way or the other. And
so
I'm happy
they
to
have
hear it.
not. So $4.5 billion was spent on housing and reducing homelessness, and there's not even knowledge if the funding is making a difference. And you said in your opening statements, Minister, that you have to have measured targets. If you are not measuring something, how do you know if it's working? And so where I'm going with this is chronic homelessness has increased by how much since 2016?
Look, I don't have the specific figure in front of me. Romy, do you have the data point she's looking for, or Kelly?
All right. Yes, we do know that chronic homelessness, actually has stayed relatively the same at about 30,000, but homelessness has increased. And so we know for 2021, for example, that 94,000 people used emergency shelters. And then we know unsheltered homelessness, or people in encampments, and we see that very visible across the country, has increased about 100%. And so we know that those have been, important changes.
Thank
in
you.
the
And I
context that we're
don't
living.
mean to interrupt. So if people are watching at home, we have very limited time, so we try to get in as much as we can. But there was a 2016 housing strategy, and we talked about this in committee too. And it's all fine and well to have a housing strategy, and I think, your intentions seem good, Minister. But there seems to be a disconnect between the Prime Minister who runs this country and what you are saying here in this committee. And on behalf of all of Canadians and people who are living in tents, especially in Halifax, which has went up 500%, this is not reaching measured targets. And I think, you got upset with Andrew Scheer, my colleague, because you thought he was playing games. It's not a game. There are houses not being built. And I hear your empathy. I hear your intention, and I hear you trying to say we're going to do things differently. But nothing has happened. And I want to point to you, and in terms of where these operational dollars are going, and this is why we talk about you have to build homes and not bureaucracy, and that is what the Liberal government has done. There is a youth emergency shelter in my riding. There are 19 family units. These are parents with children, and 39 youth on the by name list in Peterborough. And this is underrepresented. Reaching Home is the only federal homelessness funding that they know of. It provides funding for transitional housing, amongst other things. They receive funding to cover the cost of one prevention worker. That's where operational dollars are going. So when you go downtown Peterborough, when you go downtown Halifax, and in Ottawa that has record numbers of people living in tents, that's why. Because of bureaucracy. And so they have a question, and I'm here elected on behalf of Peterborough Kawartha, and they want to know. I would ask the Finance Minister how they account for the cost associated for homelessness. Shelter plus emergency services equals costs higher than providing transitional or permanent affordable housing. And why are they not offering funding to the organizations that are already offering the solution to expand their housing programs? And from Marcel Lebrun, who runs 12 Neighbours, he says, why are we not getting these funds in our hands quickly? These are life-changing programs. And I hear you, but honestly, we don't believe you. And that is the problem that is on the ground. And I would leave it with you, Minister, to answer that, because what you're saying and what you're doing are not adding up. And we saw that today in the House of Commons between your Prime Minister, who says, oh, we're sorry, but we're not going to change anything that we're doing.
Mr. Chair, so I agree on the scale of the challenge with my colleague. And I think it's important that we all acknowledge that due to a range of factors, homelessness is a problem, and a growing problem in certain particular parts of the country, I should say, as well. One of the things that I find difficult to accept is, given her intervention, is that I have a hard time accepting it at face value when she and her colleagues voted against doubling funding for homelessness.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, because
Mr.
it is
Chair,
my
do I
time,
have,
and I would stand by voting against that, because you know what's happened in this country? People can't afford to live, and we voted against those programs, and it didn't matter because it passed anyway.
The convention Mr. Scheer had indicated earlier is important about the witness having equal time.
It hasn't made a difference.
One of the things that I think we have to ask ourselves is, first, what more can we do? When I look at the comparative advantages of the plan that we are building and the one that the Conservatives recently released, I would point out that there is no homelessness funding in the Conservative plan. There is no affordable housing funding in the Conservative plan.
Mr. Chair, it's
Mr.
not
Chair,
our plan. There is the
time
government's job to do this.
Concludes Ms. Ferrari. Your time. We'll now move to Mr. Collins for 5 minutes, and please stick to the subject matter. Mr. Collins?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. And if the minister wants to answer that last point, I'd be interested in hearing it.
One of the things that I find difficult to accept, in particular, since Mr. Poilievre, over the course of the summer, has been touting himself as some working class hero with all the solutions for housing, shooting videos for Twitter that he seems to communicate effectively that he understands the anxiety people are going through. And I think we all need to better reflect the very real anxiety people are going through. But when I see we come back to Ottawa after the summer and they put forward a plan, it's unimaginably weak. There is no funding for housing for low-income families. There is no plan to address homelessness. He says he's building homes and not bureaucracy, and introduced the most bureaucratic possible form of the GST. He wants to hire public servants to run a snitch line for purposes I can't possibly imagine. He wants to cut the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is worth $4 billion, to put $100 million on the table that will only apply in 22 cities. Yep. I go up and down the plan, and I just see that people seemingly within the Conservative caucus don't understand the scale of the problem that we're dealing with, despite the rhetoric. So I find it hard to accept that someone would criticize our record on homelessness, which I will be the first to acknowledge we need to do more on, because there are vulnerable people out there. But when I hear the rhetoric and it's matched with a voting record that opposed doubling funding for homelessness, a voting record where the entire Conservative Party voted against the national housing strategy, what puts money in place for affordable housing, it makes no sense. Let's not just focus on the things that people could have done over the past 20 or 30 years. It's important to acknowledge, but compare one plan to the other and figure out who's actually going to do more. And 7 days a week, I know that the measures that we're advancing, even in the last few weeks, will dwarf the proposed plan that Mr. Poilievre has put forward.
Thank you. You know, I want to stick with the Housing Accelerator Fund because it seems to be the topic of discussion today. And you've talked about working with municipalities, and I've had to sit in the House and listen to the nonsensical, taglines, the bumper sticker solutions in terms of, get rid of the gatekeepers and nonsense like that. I'll tell you, coming from the municipal sector, municipalities across the country have been dealing with they've been building a record number of houses up into the time of the pandemic. And so they were breaking municipal records. They were in Hamilton, and I know in Ontario, it's the context that the area that I've come from, they were doing much the same in different areas. And so to hear that municipalities aren't doing enough, and then to demonize mayors and councillors for not doing their fair share, when for the last 30 years, they were the only ones, by and large, across the country that were doing their fair share on the affordable housing scene. They were cash poor and land rich and had to find unique ways then to build affordable housing units and housing supply. And so, like you, it's difficult to listen to some of the comments in terms of, they had their opportunity. FCM, municipalities across Canada begged and pleaded for support. It didn't come, and hence came the National Housing Strategy. So I want you to, if you could, just reference, how important it is, instead of demonizing municipalities, and blaming them for the situation that we're in. And this is very much where we were with former Premier Harris, when he demonized municipalities for not doing enough, and then he talked about amalgamation and all those other things, and it was the common sense revolution. And Mr. Chair, we heard this week the common sense legislation. very much like what we heard from a former Conservative Premier in Ontario, demonizing municipalities for not doing their part. So I'm just hoping very briefly, Minister, if you could talk about why it's important to work with our partners, work with municipalities who've done their fair share, and I think illustrate what contrast we have in terms of our approach to dealing with our partners in that space.
Sure. And look, Mr. Chair, how much time do I have before time expires? 2 minutes. Okay. It's really important to work with partners at different levels of government. And some of the greatest leaders in terms of reforming the way that Canada is going to build homes are municipal government leaders, their mayors, their councillors. There are others who do need to be pushed, but we still need to partner with them. And there are others still who've never dealt with a housing crunch like they're facing now and don't have the muscle memory to know how to respond, but very much want to, but maybe need a partner to help from a funding perspective, to help share best practices. So depending on the community you're dealing with, the circumstances are different. One of the Housing Accelerator Fund is a great example. It's not the only one, but it's a great example of how we can leverage municipal cooperation and partnership by putting real money on the table that's going to incentivize change. Municipal councillors know what it's like to have a little extra cash to invest in the infrastructure they need to have livable communities and communities that can actually have the capacity to accommodate more housing developments. If I actually look back in the spirit of comparing what's actually being put on the table, the Housing Accelerator Fund is $4 billion across Canada that's going to help. We've now got in excess of 500 applications have come in. Compare that to the difference that would be made under the Conservative plan with a $100 million contribution that's only going to be split between 22 or so communities. And it's also going to require, it ignores the fact that sometimes communities need the investments in infrastructure they're threatening to cut if they're going to meet the targets that they're now setting. It makes no sense. If we actually work with municipalities, find the good leaders out there and incentivize change that they're already pushing, but then find the ones who are laggards and push them to do more. I think we can actually squeeze more productivity out of every federal dollar and create an ecosystem, not just for the next couple of years, but for the next couple of generations. We'll have a different way that people build homes because it will be legal to build the kinds of homes that are required to solve the crisis, that it will be faster to permit the kinds of homes that will be built that will help solve the crisis. If we work with municipalities, push ones to go further where they need a push, and work with the leaders who are already there by incentivizing change, we can make a major difference.
Thanks, Mr.
Collins. Monsieur Trudel pour 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm trying to understand what you're telling us, how we are going to build affordable houses, houses that people can pay for. Talking about the GST, how many houses do you think you will build from that GST relief? Did you do the math because of that tax relief?
So the estimates that I've seen range between 200,000 and 300,000 over the next decade or so, but it depends on other factors that are within the control of other levels of government as well. That number could increase if provincial governments come on board with similar measures. It will increase further if we grow the productive capacity of the Canadian workforce. So it's hard to look at it in isolation, but the estimates I've seen tend to range between 200,000 and 300,000 homes.
Bon, combien de logements?
How many houses amongst those houses will be affordable houses, and how many of them will be low-cost housing? My question is, well, you said you don't want to consider the criteria for affordability, but private developers will make money. That's how it works. One of the problems we have with the national strategy is that most of the funds are going to private developers who are building huge structures in Montreal. And you have single mothers, victims of domestic violence, and people like that who cannot be helped. So how can we build houses to help such people?
Je suis tout à fait d'accord.
I totally agree with you. It's essential for us to continue building houses for more vulnerable people. It is also important to understand reasons for each policy
we have put in place. It's addressed at building more supply. There are other programs that are tackling the measures you're dealing with that offer a parallel track for people to build more affordable.
Lequel, Monsieur le Ministre, lequel? Parce que là, je comprends.
What are they, Mr. Minister? I understand that with the GST relief, you are not targeting affordability. Now, there are bottlenecks with developers. I understand the issues are great. So it's a gigantic plan. Can we find a way of asking the private sector to help us? It's your responsibility to lodge everyone in the society, not only those who can afford housings in downtown Montreal. What about those who can only afford $600, $700? Under what program can houses be built for such people?
So there are programs specifically targeted to the issues that you're dealing with, like the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, like the Rapid Housing Initiative, like the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, but to a different degree. But I don't want to ignore the importance of increasing supply and reducing the cost for everyone, including low-income families. By moving forward with the GST, we're going to reduce the cost of building and making it more reasonable for people to build the kinds of buildings that ordinary people can afford to pay for. When you complement that measure with the other programs I've mentioned, you're going to see additional incentives to build homes below market value and in some instances geared to people's income so they can afford it regardless of their ability to pay.
Bon, Monsieur le Ministre.
Mr. Minister, one of the federal programs that's working well is a Canadian initiative for rapid housing. Everyone has talked about it, the Rapid Housing Initiative. That works well. People understand it well. People understand that it's working well. What I'm saying is that you can simply scrap the national strategy that's not working and channel all funds to that program, because at the cost of $1 billion, I think it's $1 billion or $1.5 billion, well, we'll not make it. If we put billions in that program, we will really be able to build low-cost and affordable houses. Have you thought about that?
Oui, mais ce n'est pas.
Yes, but it's not possible to address the national crisis only using that program. We need to come up with other options to attract investment from the private sector as well.
Millions of homes, and the per unit cost through a program that's designed specifically for affordable housing can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. You have to realize that if we're going to spend our way out of this, we would be waiting a very long time. We need to continue to directly invest in affordable housing projects through initiatives such as the Rapid Housing Initiative, but we also need to create the framework and conditions for home builders to build based on the economics of a project, not just the scale of the subsidy. So we need to pursue both tracks to grow the supply by changing the system, but we also need to continue to make the investments necessary to build dedicated non-market housing.
Bon, merci le ministre. J'aimerais parler.
I would like to talk about homelessness, Mr. Minister. Thank you. What I've heard on the ground is the fact that homelessness has doubled in Quebec. What has changed a lot is the regionalization of homelessness. The Reaching Home strategy sends money to designated communities, so the major cities in Quebec. But what we're seeing now is homelessness in small municipalities, Saint-Jean-de-Dieu, in Témiscouata, and so on. They don't have resources because they're not used to dealing with homelessness in these areas. So we need to review the program, enhance it when it concerns money. We need to try to increase the supply of money.
I think it's something we need to constantly reassess. I have seen in my own community a change that we did not experience. As I mentioned during my opening, we're used to having many homes available because so many families moved away. The circumstances have changed. Housing is not available. Homelessness is a real problem, even in small-town Nova Scotia. To the extent we need to change our programs to reflect changes to the environment that we're living in, I'm somebody who's not dogmatic, who will dig in and say the first way is the only way we're going to do it. I hope that was reflected as we advanced policies during the pandemic. When we heard from Canadians we needed to make changes, I got more compliments from my constituents about our willingness to change than I did about any one program. We're now looking for ways to change the course to respond to the current dynamics that exist so we can address very, very real problems, including for very vulnerable Canadians.
J'aimerais juste vous dire que ça presse parce que... Oh, excusez-moi.
Madame Cirillo or Ms. Kwan? Madame Cirillo?
Thank
for
you.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Minister, I'm hoping that we'll be able to have that meeting soon that we had to cancel recently. I wanted to talk about systemic problems in getting housing affordability built. So I was looking forward to seeing you here today, just because I wanted to hear from you your value position, your mentality of addressing this crisis, because we know that the crisis cannot be fixed with the same market-focused mentality of the governments current and past. And here's an example. I wanted to share with you, and perhaps you know this, I guess I'll ask you, did you know that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is investing in REITs? Retrofits that result in renovictions and rent hikes. The Canada Infrastructure Bank is doing that. Avenue Living Asset Manager, an owner and operator of properties primarily out in the prairies, has received commitments from the CIBC for retrofits. Is your plan to continue to use the CIB, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, for REITs and renovictions?
One of the things that I think is important when we deal with the Canada Infrastructure Bank is the investment decisions that it makes will be independent of me. I would encourage the Infrastructure Bank to consider how they can be investing in projects that will grow the housing supply, but that would typically be more along the lines of housing enabling infrastructure. But I can't dictate the specific investments that they would make in individual kinds of projects.
Thank you, Minister. I'll just bring it to your attention that this is just a continuation of the systemic problem around this government and past governments having a really market-based lens, even though we knew that no federal investment for 40 years in social housing, no plan for expiring operating agreements for not-for-profits, no investments in maintenance of co-ops, and no appetite for risk. So this is the other thing I wanted to talk about as we talk about risk. Minister, were you aware that the CMHC pension plan holds real estate, 16%, and that of that real estate, a percentage of it is residential real estate? Do you think that's a conflict of interest, Minister?
Look, I don't want to be interfering with the independent decisions of pension investments. Protecting the ability of pension boards to make independent decisions to protect the pensions of workers is something that's extremely important to me. I think that it's possible for a pension board to make investment decisions that don't necessarily interfere with the ability of an organization to still continue to support housing. Just on your broader focus on the market focus versus non-market focus, my view is that we need to do both. And I think some market measures can address affordable housing, though it's more targeting increasing supply. But in parallel, we need to advance measures as well that support non-market housing, including co-ops, as per the comments I made earlier.
Thank you, Minister. And I encourage you to continue to work very closely with MP Jenny Kwan, then, because I know that she has many, many solutions that we need to take under advisement. I wanted to also ask about the CMHC's mandate. So again, going back to my topic of systemic problems. FCM has called for a review of CMHC's mandate. Will you take on that review of CMHC's mandate?
So I'm happy to review on an ongoing basis. I think the only details I would quibble with are what specifically are we going to be reviewing and for what purpose. To the extent that we want to continue to encourage a focus on increasing supply and growing the non-market supply, I think that's important. My own view is we need to continue to use the organization with a primary focus of building more homes for Canadians who need them at prices they can actually afford. But the details of what kind of or level of formality of what that process would look like would something I would want to have a proper opportunity to consider before making a public commitment.
Thank you, Minister. And I'll just take a minute then to suggest a couple. One is Ms. Bowers, and it's good to have Ms. Bowers here again today. Ms. Bowers made this comment to this committee before that we have been for many decades, CMHC was not involved in the delivery of affordable housing, and we have lost connections with many institutions in the non-profit sector. I think this is an area that needs to be addressed, is how do you remake those connections with the non-profit sector? And the other systemic program or problem that we would say with CMHC is again, that lack of data collection, that lack of measuring tools, and that lack of understanding. So I would put those couple out.
Just very, very quickly before I turn the floor over to Ms. Bowers, look, I agree with you. Due to a lack of investment by different governments of different partisan persuasion for decades, there was a lot of muscle memory that was lost. And I think building those relationships for continuity and efficiency is important. But Ms. Bowers, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for that question. And I've had the privilege of speaking to this committee before about the decades during which CMHC was not engaged in delivery of affordable housing. With the launch of the National Housing Strategy in 2017, we've had to reestablish our connection with the nonprofit sector. I think, the early years, there were many learnings, but I think in the subsequent years, I think you've seen a strengthening of the relationship. Can we do better? Absolutely. Are we committed to supporting the nonprofit sector to deliver non-market housing? Certainly, and always welcome to feedback that would strengthen our capabilities.
So if I could just have the last 10 seconds or so. So Minister, will you commit today to take on a review of at least this portion of the CMHC's mandate?
You know what? Just before I commit to a formal review, I will commit to having a specific meeting with you about what a review would look like, and then I'll want advice on what shape that kind of an exercise would take. But let's have that conversation privately at the soonest opportunity.
Ms. Cirillo, Mr. Scheer for 5 minutes.
So the CMHC, that stands for the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. That's the federal agency responsible for housing.
Yeah, there's a more specific mandate, but that's the Crown Corporation that we deal with on our housing programs.
And that agency, that corporation reports to you directly?
Yes.
Okay. And you talked about core mandate. I'm just reading off the CMHC's website. It says, we are driven by one goal, housing affordability for all. Housing starts are down. Were you expecting housing starts to fall?
When I saw an increase in interest rate and the cost of supplies, it makes sense to me from a basic economic point of view. I think home construction has been on a positive trend over the last number of years.
Is that a yes?
In light of recent changes, yes, but it would depend when you would ask me that question because...
Housing starts are down. They were down this year again. In fact, CMHC's own report predicts that housing start. We also, this is from their 2023 Housing Market Outlook report that said, we also expect housing starts to decline in 2023 and remain well below recent levels posted in the 2020 to 2022 period over the forecast period. So they were down over those periods and they're going to be down in the future. My question is, does that sound like the CMHC is achieving their goal of affordability for all?
There's a piece of clarity that will provide context. That's based on the policy track that existed at the time that would have been generated, which was fairly recently. But for example, the expansion of the Canada Mortgage Bond or the GST were not factored in. I want to change that policy track.
It was a simple question. Do you think that CMHC is hitting their goal of affordable housing, making housing affordable?
I think we need to do much more, including having CMHC do much more.
Okay. Can you tell Canadians why officials at CMHC received almost $27 million in bonuses? They have one job, making housing affordable for all. That's their goal on their website. That's their own words. They have resources to do that. They collect premiums off the backs of mortgage payers, people who cannot afford to put the entire amount down for a house or even 20% down, have to pay CMHC fees. Those premiums are paid into the CMHC fund. And that management team paid themselves $27 million worth of bonuses over the last few years. Do you think the officials at CMHC achieved their goal and deserved those bonuses?
I can completely understand why when people hear a figure like that and start asking questions about the appropriateness. From my point of view, I think it's really very important that elected officials don't interfere with the compensation of individual public servants. I think what's most important is we need to have a process that's independent, that is designed.
This is not about the independence of the compensation. This is about bonuses. Bonuses in the federal civil service are awarded to individuals who exceed expectations. $27 million were paid out to CMHC officials during a time when housing starts went down, when mortgage costs doubled, when rents doubled, when the dream of home ownership was obliterated out of the reach of Canadians hoping to move out of home or start their life. And during that time, the officials at CMHC were paid $27 million by your government. Why?
One of the things that I think is really important to understand is that there is a process where there's an independent assessment of whether people meet the standard that's expected of them. I would say I don't attribute the changes in the financial landscape to any public servant at CMHC.
That's their goal.
But I'm not.
Okay, quick question, Mr. I don't have a lot of time. You're not providing clear answers. Who appoints the CEO of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation?
That's the Government of Canada.
So you do?
There's more than an individual involved in that process, but I am one of the people who would be involved.
Well, it says on the CMHC website that it's appointed by the minister. So you appoint the CEO.
There's a role for the Department of Finance as well, but I take your point. Continue.
So the management team at CMHC, after looking at the past few years, seeing housing starts go down, after hearing stories about 35-year-olds moving back into their parents' basement, after seniors have been forced into homeless shelters and students have to live in the car, they looked at the housing landscape in Canada and said, let's pay ourselves a big, fat bonus. And your government said, no problem.
That's not how the process works. That is not how the process works.
You and your government have an opportunity to ensure performance from the officials who report to you. So, simple question. Going forward, will you demand to see any bonuses proposed by the CMHC, yes or no?
So, will I demand to see
any proposal require your sign-off going forward? That money was already paid, despite the fact that CMHC did not make housing more affordable for all. Will you take any steps to ensure that performance bonuses are linked to performance targets and actual results?
I'm happy to review the process by which bonuses are provided. I am very hesitant to have elected officials interfere with the independence of the public service when it comes to the appropriate compensation for public servants.
So you don't believe that the minister has any oversight role in bonuses paid out to people who don't do their job?
Is concluded. Mr. Van Bynen for 5 minutes. Mr. Van Bynen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want the conversation to focus solely on CMHC. I do know that we have arranged for CMHC to come back to this committee one more time. And we did have a study, and there were some recommendations that I hope we could discuss at that time when CMHC comes back, one of which was the efficiency of the application process and the responsiveness to the clients. And I think that's an important question that we should be hearing about when we come back to that. But I'd like to go back to the fact that we have a number of approaches to solving the affordability issue. And in my riding of Newmarket Aurora, because of the GST waiver, which is currently under debate, I did have a developer contact me and say that he was going to go ahead with 390 new rental units that have been in the hopper for over 2 years now, but the business model didn't work. And now with the GST waiver, the business model does work, and my community is going to have 390 new units. But I want to go beyond that and talk about an example of collaboration between the governments and how important that is. In 2020, through the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, our government was able to advance a $79 million construction loan that resulted in 216 units in my riding. And in 2023, we also announced a $77 million loan under the same program to finance an additional 175. So this emphasizes that it isn't always giving money away in terms of the reduction of CMHC, but working together with the developer, with the municipality, and with the financing organization to cover and manage the risk during the construction period. Can you explain how the funding of the Rental Construction Financing Initiative will help families and build more housing?
Yeah, and look, I thank you for the question, Mr. Van Bynen, and I think it's important to understand that these policies don't operate in isolation. They work in parallel and one on top of the other, and your citing of the GST I think it provides a good example. So everything we can do to change the financial equation to make it more likely for a builder to go ahead is going to help address the supply challenges that we're facing. The GST obviously knocked several percentage points off overnight, and in jurisdictions where provincial governments have followed suit, even more so. If you piggyback on top of that now more attractive financial landscape, programs like the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, you're going to see that more people are going to be building homes, but also building particular kinds of homes. So the Rental Construction Financing Initiative operates essentially by giving a lower cost of financing, typically in exchange for some kind of a commitment that you'll offer a certain number of units at a particular percentage of market rates. We made a recent announcement in Vancouver that's going to make available $500 million in financing that's going to see, I think it was 11 different projects. It could be 9 different projects. I'm testing my memory here. And they are typically close to transit or post-secondary institutions. They're typically offered at a fraction of what the market would bear. And because we've changed the equation by offering competitive, low-cost financing in a high-cost financing environment, we're seeing more developers who are interested in building the kinds of homes that will be offered at a lower price because they have access to financing that allows the project to go ahead. So everything that we do, whether it's making more low-cost financing available through RCFI, cutting the GST for apartments that'll be built, or expanding access to low-cost financing by growing our insurance programs through the Canada Mortgage Bond, we're going to see more competitive rates for people who have the capacity to build homes. And although I'm very encouraged, I'm entirely unsurprised to hear your community is seeing more people announce they will go ahead with projects, because I'm hearing it in every community in Canada.
In my community, we're looking at close to 2,000 new units. For a community that has 24,000 homes, I think that's quite substantial. And I believe that we need to have the building community and private markets participate in solving this solution. We'll never be able to borrow our way out of this, and so we need to rely on that collaboration. A lot of conversation has been going on a number of the programs, but can you tell me more about the co-investment fund and how well that's working and what the target market is for the co-investment fund?
Yeah, the co-investment fund is a terrific program, and it provides an opportunity, and some sort of, it can be a mix of grants and loans that will allow people to build more affordable housing stock. Since you've cited your own community, I'll cite mine. The Antigonish Affordable Housing Society is a group of volunteers who decided they wanted to do something about affordable housing given some of the challenges in a university town in Nova Scotia. They hopped online, started working with people in the space. They learned about the co-investment fund. They now have navigated what can be a complex system, and there's members of my community who now have a place to live. And the stories that you hear are life-changing for people. There's a young woman who has been able to return to school who told me that her son is able to now take part in elite basketball camps because she can afford to take him, because she's not spending all of her money on housing. I've run out of time, but it's a perfect example of just how powerful this fund is to build more units at prices that people can afford, and it's meaningful stuff.
Thank you.
Monsieur Trudel, pour 2 minutes et demi.
It's unfortunate, but I do not understand how we are going to build affordable houses, low-cost houses, after listening to you for 2 hours. One of the major issues that we've not discussed is financialization of housing. So a study was done recently, which even the Canadian housing advocate who supposedly works with you defines financialization of housing is the fact that housing is more and more considered as a good instead of a social need for people and communities. When the federal government came up, very few houses were owned by investment trust, but now a lot of these houses are owned by developers who don't care about the people. All they want to do is make money. How are we going to legislate to prevent a greater financialization of housing in Canada?
First, let me just address your preamble, and I'll acknowledge that you had recognized yourself some of the programs are effective in terms of delivering housing for low-income families. You specifically mentioned the Rapid Housing Initiative. On the financialization of housing, there's no one policy that will completely cure the circumstances, but we need to continue to do more. And there's no one level of government, by the way, that can, with the strike of a pen, solve all of the challenges. So, for example, dealing with people who may be buying up homes and evicting tenants so they can increase the price, there could be mixed jurisdiction from different levels of government. But there are some things that we have done, and I would acknowledge that we could do more. Things around additional taxation on the flipping of homes, things around additional taxes for foreign-owned, unoccupied homes, changing the tax rates for short-term rentals like Airbnb. These are all things that we have made progress on, but I would argue need to continue to do more on. Housing, to me, cannot be a commodity. It has to be a place for families to live in real communities. And if you have advice on further areas we can tackle that don't interfere with the ability to continue to grow the supply, it's an area that I think we can cooperate.
Trudel, 2 seconds. Are you taking the question?
Yes, thank you. I want to follow up with the minister on the question around co-op housing and urge the minister to reconsider. As he knows, many of the co-ops are nonprofit co-ops. It's not like they're actually making money in the share system that he actually mentioned. And so it's important for GST to be exempt for the co-op sector as well. Now, he actually talked about the importance of co-op. Budget 2022 did make an allocation for a co-op program. And however, to this day, not one dime has actually rolled out for the program. There hasn't even been an agreement signed with respect to that. So what's the hang up? And when will Canadians see the money roll out the door to build the housing that's desperately needed?
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. I don't have a specific date, but rest assured, as soon as we're ready to launch, we'll be broadcasting it broadly. The ordinary process for us to, as I described in response to Mr. Scheer earlier in this meeting, is after we budget it, we have to go through the appropriate cycle before I have access to administer a program that we design. But my hope is to move these programs as quickly as possible because I don't think there is time to waste.
Yeah, Budget 2023's come and went, and we're still talking about rolling out Budget 2022 initiatives that the government promised. So actually, the slowdown is happening from the government side. Let's get on with it. On the co-investment fund, the minister actually said about the value of that program. Now, it is an onerous bureaucracy that nonprofits are saddled with in trying to get through it. Now, as it stands, the funding for the co-investment fund has primarily been depleted, and to the point where the department has actually reduced the amount of funding nonprofits can apply for at $25,000 per unit. This is not going to work. So my question to the minister is, will the minister do what the NDP is calling for, and that is actually provide eliminate the $25,000 per unit limit and provide new funds to the co-investment fund so that more nonprofits can access the funding to develop the housing that Canadians desperately need?
So I anticipate I'll have an opportunity to look at increasing the contribution amount through the co-investment fund in the short term. One decision point that I will need to take on and the government will need to take on is what the next generation of investments in affordable housing will look like. I believe I owe it to myself and frankly to communities across the country to do a proper exercise to understand the best way to increase the supply of non-market housing. The co-investment has had some success, as you've pointed out. I think there are areas it can improve, and I want to make sure I have an opportunity to compare continued investment in the co-investment fund with other potential avenues to grow the supply of non-market housing in Canada, which I understand is a major priority for you as well.
Yeah, for sure. The area that could be improved would be the red tape that CMHC is saddling people with in the bureaucracy that they have to go through to try and get that fund through.
Mr. Chambers for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, thanks for coming. I'll note that some of your colleagues don't even accept invitations to come to committee, but thank you for coming under your own volition. Bloomberg and many others have talked about the risk in the Canadian marketplace with respect to overheated housing market or a bubble. Are you concerned about risk to taxpayers if rates continue to stay high or higher for longer as we're actually seeing?
Look, I have many concerns. The risks, given the rate of interest that exists in the market, is one of them. I'm more concerned about the risk to Canadians who don't have a place to live that they can afford than I am about the risk to taxpayers, given the very present and serious challenge that families are facing. But it's one of many concerns that I think on daily.
Sure. Don't have time to get into it, but Ms. Bowers, could you provide to the committee later the total net and gross exposure that the Canadian taxpayers have through CMHC? You did provide that a couple of years ago, but I'd like an updated number if that's okay.
Yes, I'd be very happy to.
Thank you very much. Minister David Dodge, John Manley, the current governor of the Bank of Canada, have all said that government spending, all levels of government spending, is driving inflation, which is making the Bank of Canada hold rates higher for longer or maybe even increase them further. Have you expressed concern to your colleagues or the Minister of Finance that they need to rein in spending so that Canadians don't face the pressure of continued interest rate hikes or it staying higher longer?
I've had many conversations with colleagues about the need to make sure that we're spending responsibly, and we are not, by the way, in a position where we will not have access to the ability to borrow. There is the potential to impact the interest rate, but my perspective is that a huge portion of the inflation we've seen is driven by supply side factors when you look at the equation, whether that's the impact that climate change has had on the price of food, whether that is the impact of the war in Ukraine on the price of energy or the price of wheat that's exported. There's a number of different factors that have interrupted supply chains, have driven up the cost of labor and materials that I think are more responsible. But this is an issue that we need to be careful about, and we need to make sure that we're spending responsibly.
Last 30 seconds. We've talked a lot about supply side. No one's really admitting the fact that it's going to be very hard. Douglas Porter at BMO says it's almost impossible to build the amount of homes. We haven't really talked about demand. I don't want to talk about immigration, but I want to talk about short-term rental housing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you even understand or know, does the government know, have they asked how many units have actually been taken off market and used for short-term rentals? There's some studies that suggest in some cities that up to 10,000 units could be released if somebody actually started asking the right questions. I don't know why this committee hasn't asked for it yet, frankly, from some of the short-term rental units, but why are we not looking there?
We have made a policy change with respect to the taxation of short-term rentals that will make it less appealing for people who own a property to take it off the market so they can profit from short-term rentals. This is actually an area where I'll ask for everyone's help. I think that we, given the nature of your question, likely agree that this is an opportunity to free up housing for families that are not being used currently for anything beyond short-term stays. I would welcome the recommendations of this committee should you choose to study measures the federal government can impose to actually reduce the number of homes that are being used for short-term rentals, particularly where they exist in communities where families need homes. And these days, that's just about everywhere.
Thank you, Minister.
Conclude.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister and officials, for being here. Minister, you mentioned London already, and without surprise, I'm going to ask you about London. To what extent do you think that the approach that was taken with respect to the Housing Accelerator Fund can serve as a model for other communities in terms of how you and the federal government approach the entire issue of building and building more through the HALF program, the collaboration, the back and forth, the very healthy back and forth that happened there, among other ways to engage communities. But can London be that model?
Before I answer your question, I knew you were going to ask about London because I sat on the Finance Committee with you during the pandemic, and you asked about London every single day, and I knew you would be true to character. It's exactly the model that should be replicated across the country. London submitted, I should say, an ambitious application to grow its housing stock. They had e-permitting they were wanting to adopt. They had upzoning. They had plans to focus particularly on affordable housing and supportive housing, and recognizing that affordable housing is a healthcare issue. They're demonstrating leadership. but we didn't want to leave homes on the table that we could squeeze out of their Housing Accelerated Fund application. We pushed them to do more, to have 4 units as of right, citywide, for example. We had conversations about what more they can do to continue to build homes, as they have plans to, around post-secondary institutions, around transit lines, and a handful of other measures. They responded back in the most encouraging way possible. They said, yes, 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 we want to do it all, and if you support our application, we'll be able to do it. The result is that thousands of additional homes are going to be built in London over the next few years. But better than that, permanently changing the way that London permits homes to be built and the homes that they allow to be built is going to carry on forever. This is the kind of thing that is going to have a lasting impact, not just over the next few years under the period of the Housing Accelerator Fund's contemplated timelines, but permanently. And it's this kind of change in cities like London, across the country, in communities big and small, that's going to help us escape the housing crisis and make sure ordinary people have homes they can afford.
Thank you for that. With my remaining time, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to put him on the spot, but I know he'll appreciate it anyway. I'll give my time to Mr. Morris for a quick question.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I want to start by just saying that I really appreciate the candor you've brought to this conversation, Minister. I appreciate the genuine sense of collaboration that you're bringing to this role. I think it's really important if we're going to share in the fact that we're in a housing crisis to have someone in your position open to working together to try to solve it. I also think it's important to make clear that, as you've said, this is a crisis that's decades in the making. It's not going to be solved within weeks. But I think what is reasonable to expect is to see seeds planted for a solution, both in terms of sustained investments and addressing the way that homes have been treated as commodities instead of places for people to live. You and I have spoken about one way to do that, which is removing exemptions for large corporate investors who've been commodifying the housing market. Real estate investment trust being one example of that. In my view, a clear litmus test for being serious about this. Can you share whether you're going to give this idea some consideration over the coming weeks and months?
So, look, I assume I have 10 seconds, Mr. Chair. It's okay, 20. So I'm open to all suggestions. I think we have to make sure that any special measures we have in place are actually productive uses of public money. Before I commit to any particular policy proposal on the exact measure that you've identified, I want to be very, very careful not to interrupt the potential addition of supply to the market with policy changes that have not been fully studied and understood. It may be another area where I believe the Finance Committee is actually going to cover this in their report on the financialization of housing, but more broadly making sure that we're treating homes like places for people and families to live, as opposed to commodities that people can hold on to and have the value appreciate, is going to be an essential part of the path forward. I just want to make sure, to the extent we consider policy changes, it doesn't interfere with the supply, because that is of a paramount concern to me right now.
Minister, committee members, just a moment. The minister is leaving. Thank you for appearing, Minister.
And thank you
with your officials.
Appreciate it.
Well, certainly you can see there's a lot of interest from this committee with the exchange. Everybody is approaching it from the same level of concern.
Merci.
Committee members, to remind you of witness lists for the study on Canada summer jobs. Madame Chabot. Madame Chabot. Earpiece back, Madame.
Madame Chabot,
Madame, reminding members to get their witness lists in for the upcoming study on Canada summer jobs. Yes, by the end of the day, Friday, September 29th. As well, is it the minister's wish, is it the committee's wish to have the minister in on October the 16th? That's the date that she has given that she's available. If I see consensus, then we will. Octobre 16.
16?
Oui.
Okay.
Oui. Oh. Yes, so the minister will be in on October the 16th. I see consensus here on the Canada Summer Job Study. With that, the next meeting will be on committee business and version 2 of the financialization report. Mr. Aitchison, you?
Yeah, just a quick point of order, if I could. I don't know if this has ever been done before or not, but I thought maybe I would table Leader of the Opposition's PMV with the committee because, of course, it was disparaged a little bit, and I just wanted to point out that it really is about accountability and targets, and it's holding municipalities accountable. So I think that it was misrepresented, and I think it's actually pretty good. So.
Okay, Mr. Aitchison. So with that, committee members, thank you for your time. We'll see you next week. Committee adjourned. Merci, madame.